As many of you know, I teach school during public school in Dallas Independent School District when I'm not here. That's kind of the way it goes. I do go home to sleep. That's about it. My kids think I live at school. And Doris thinks I live here. But anyway, so it all works out. But in any case, one of the things I like to do is I teach my children, I teach them the Star-Spangled Banner. But I tell them the story behind the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, perhaps you know that story as well. It was written by Francis Scott Key in a pitch that very few people can sing, right? You know, you hear that on the baseball fields at each opening. Folks can't sing that. But the part that I always get the kids to act it out, and I tell them how Francis Scott Key had been kidnapped and was a prisoner of war on a ship out in the darkest night, in a stormy night. And it was so dark, and all that was going on was the guns, the battle guns, and the cannons of the ship firing across the ocean over there at Fort McHenry, where the Patriots were, you know, and they had this little raggedy flag of the United States of America flying over that fort. And it became so dark and so smoky from the fire of the cannon that Francis Scott Key took out a pen and he wrote about, through the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night, the light of the explosions, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. And then I hear those words, oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And when I think about that horrible battle and the state of that man's soul standing on that ship with nothing but the spray of the water and the splash of the sea and the dark of the night and the rage of the battle all around him, a man whose hope was on the edge of despair saw through the light that the flag of this country was still there. And though this week we will be celebrating our freedom, I can't help but remember every time I sing that song, I can't help but remember the great price tag of our freedom and what it has cost this nation in terms of the men and women who have served it. And I remember that freedom comes at the cost of someone else's servitude. Just as I remember that our spiritual freedom that we have from sin and death came to us through the servanthood of our Lord Jesus Christ. There is that sort of yin and yang structure of the universe, isn't there? I remember, if you remember those first lines of Genesis, that it says that the world was chaos. The ancients even named the God of the earth and of the world Chaos, because that was the ruler of this world. Because chaos ruled in darkness, and in the God Chaos was darkness. As we know in our Genesis account that the God of our creation came in to the universe and the Spirit of God moved powerfully across the darkness. And into that darkness came light. And into that light began the ordering and the structuring of our universe. So chaos was defeated by the order of the mighty Creator God. And so there's always this struggle going on in our world today between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, the forces that would order and the forces that would cause chaos within our lives. And I'm sure we all have a list of that which causes chaos in our lives. And in that structure and in that light and in that order came life. The power of life came forth in the darkness, out of the chaos, into the order. This God that we worship brings life. And John 10:10, one of my favorite scriptures of all, Jesus tells us that I came into this universe. I came into this world. I came into your life to bring life. And not just breathing and walking and talking. Not that just barely, not existence. But I came to bring you life in abundance, in a rich quality of life. And he says, the thief came to lie. The thief lies to you. For the thief came to rob and to steal and to kill, to take away from you, to lie to you about life, to rob you of life, to destroy life. And so Jesus speaks of the world of the Spirit, wherein the Spirit of Christ comes to bring life, and the powers of this world come to take it away. In our first reading today, we hear of David mourning the king, the one whose head bore the glory of the Lord, Saul. And he delivers such a wonderful eulogy. EU means good in the Greek, you know. So he's saying all these wonderful things about Saul. And he mourns in his heart the soulmate, the greatest love that he has held for any human being in his life. He mourns the death of Jonathan. Jonathan, who did not seek powers of this world, and even though he was in line to be the next king, literally gave his right to rule to David, and did not assume power for himself, who actually stood in defiance against his own father Saul to protect his beloved David, who entered into covenant with one another to always be life for one another. David grieves. And he grieves so much for Saul and says so many things that are not even true about Saul. You know, pastors are bad about doing that when they give eulogies at funerals. I gave a eulogy for a lady one time, and somebody came up to me and said, "That was a wonderful eulogy. I wish I'd known them." Because that wasn't the person that they knew. Because the person they knew was a bit cantankerous. Like Saul. Saul was a very sick man. He had given his power over to the powers of this world. For he lived in fear constantly. Fear that his power was going to be taken from him. To the point that even though David said that he and Jonathan, his son, were together and working together in harmony all their lives long, it was not true. For Saul had actually sought to kill Jonathan on a number of occasions. He pursued David all over the Judean wilderness, trying to kill him, because he believed that David was going to take away his power. There's a wonderful story in the wilderness where David slips up on Saul at one time and takes a tassel off of his robe and cuts it off, and then runs across the canyon and leaves the sword laying beside Saul. And when Saul wakes up, there was the message from David, "Here's my sword. If I'd wanted to kill you, I could have, but instead I took this tassel of your garment. I'm loyal to you, Saul. I love you." So David, though still, celebrates the goodness. In his mourning, he celebrates the goodness that was there of Saul. Does not talk about the circumstances of Saul's death. You see, Saul, his last battle, saw all three of his children killed before his eyes. And he was going to see and face defeat in this battle. And he was wounded and he was hurt, and he did not want to experience the shame of the enemy. And so he cried to his armor bearer to kill him. And he said, no, I will not kill you. You are the Lord's anointed. And so Saul fell upon his own sword. He killed himself. He had long since stopped believing, simply believing and not fearing. And that's what Jesus said, wasn't it? Fear not, simply what? Believe. He had long since begun to consort the witches of Endor for his concern, the wisdom and counsel of human beings and not God. He fell upon his own sword and even then didn't die. And he called for one of the enemies to kill him, and that person did. David doesn't, it's in that account, I just left those verses out. But David doesn't talk about that. He celebrates the good memories that he had of Saul. I think that's an important thing to do. When we have loss, whether it's a loss of life of someone that we love, an end of a job, an end of a relationship, I think we need to stop and offer thanksgiving for that. Offer thanksgiving for that relationship and the gifts that that person brought. For Saul did a lot of wonderful things for Israel. And those are all celebrated. And then David calls to all of the women and says, weep! Weep. We try not to do that, don't we? We cry, we go, oh, I'm sorry. Why? Because we think it's shameful to weep. It's weak to weep. But David said, weep. Did he not? It's important to weep. And to let the salt water tears become the bathing, soothing, healing element for our souls. It's important to weep when we mourn. We mourn the loss of many soldiers when we celebrate our freedom, don't we? I was reading a story at the beginning of the Afghan war, when in many of the war in the Middle East. There's a story about a young, well, not a young man, but a story of an older man who came on a 4th of July weekend, sort of a Sunday, and he came to preach for the other preacher. And the title of his sermon was, he was the Sunday school leader in another church in another city. And he came to preach, and the title of his sermon was, How the Mighty Have Fallen. And he talked about that of the first 1,000 casualties that occurred in the Afghan war, he said that 462 were those casualties of war, and 468 were deaths caused by suicide. And he talked about how many of our veterans can't live and support themselves. Those who gave the ultimate sacrifice or were willing to do so now are on street corners asking for food. How, he said, the mighty have fallen. And then the story goes that Roy Perkins went and sat down and put his hands in his face, and he wept. He wept. And the obituary in the paper the next day read that his son had been one of those soldiers who had committed suicide, who had lost hope of having any quality of life, and so decided to sacrifice their lives. What a sad account that is, isn't it? Oh, do not fear, Jesus said. Only believe. Would you say that with me? Do not be afraid. Only believe. And say this for me. I have come to bring life.
I have come to bring life.
Life in abundance.
Life in abundance.
Pressed down.
Pressed down.
And heaping over.
and he made over.
The thief has come
The thief has come
to kill
to kill
and to steal
and to steal
and to lie.
and to lie.
I am the truth,
I am the truth,
the way,
the way,
and the life.
and the life.
Wow. Whenever those circumstances come to you and you think that life is hopeless and there's not any hope and you live in despair instead of hope, say those to yourself. Say those truths to yourself and remember them. That God is present with you in those times of despair. God is present with you in those times of discouragement. God is there in sickness. God is present in death. There is no shame. There is no despair for you in God's love. Stand in it and wait. I was sharing on Wednesday night with the folks that were gathered some of the writing of Karl Rahner. And I didn't really understood it, but the words stuck in my head when I was in seminary. And the longer I live, the more I understand what he was saying. He said this. He said, people need to begin to focus their lives and their spirit while they're in life on that which is true, and focus on the abundance and the gifts of God and build their faith and their trust in God while they are yet alive, because he talked about in that writing about a tearing of the soul. He said at death, the soul has to separate itself from the body, which is enmeshed in this world. And when it does so, it must have the strength, through God's help, the strength to separate itself from the body. And that's a powerful thing to have to happen. He says there's a tearing, a suffering that occurs. And I thought, what's he talking about? Tearing of souls and such. How can a soul suffer? And then I thought about every death that comes into our life causes us to separate, doesn't it? Think of all the ways that death comes. It can come financially, right? It can come in relationship with others. It can come in congregations and apart from congregations or leaving congregations. There's a tearing, there's a separation that has to occur from the values of the world and the values of the Spirit. And sometimes I think we get so enmeshed in the opinions of others and the values of this world that we forget the values of the Spirit and of the soul. And so we're over here and we're mourning and we're grieving and our hearts are breaking and it feels like our soul is tearing, and we have somehow forgotten about the hope and the truth and the life. And we begin to hear lies and we listen to lies, and the church itself begins to speak lies. When there's death in someone's life, we hear this kind of thing. We have the need to explain why it happened. What's the order of this world? Is it chaos or is it order? It's chaos, is it not? Is there a rhyme or a reason to what happens sometimes in this world? And lo and behold, some people will say, God did it. God killed him. Why do we have to say that? Best thing to do is just keep your mouth shut. Honestly, God took him. God killed him. Is that what Jesus said in John 10:10? What did he say? What was it? I came to bring what? Who came to take?
The thief.
The thief. The lie of the world is that God takes our life. God protects our life. God preserves our life. God receives our life. most damaging thing is when the church, the bride of Christ itself, becomes enmeshed with the teachings and the values of the world and becomes weak and spiritually poor. In our gospel lesson, the woman who was already marginalized in society and marginalized in her church because she was a woman, but she was doubly marginalized and excluded because she had a bleeding hemorrhage. Anyone who touched her, much less a rabbi to touch her, made them ceremonially unclean and had to be apart from the community as well. In the synagogue where Jesus was, she's following him. In the synagogue where Jairus comes and asks for help for his sick daughter who is dying, comes to Jesus to ask for life. Into that synagogue, into the press of that crowd, this woman comes. She wasn't supposed to be there. She'd already been there. She had already asked them for healing. She had already asked them for answers to the questions of their life. And they said she didn't get them. In fact, what did she get? She got worse. She got what? She got sicker, didn't she? She's almost to the point that she couldn't go anymore. And her last hope was not to be afraid, but to reach out and to touch the hem of Jesus' garment in faith, to believe, to not be afraid of what anybody would think about her or how anyone would condemn her or anyone would shame her. She reached out. She was not afraid. And her faith, Jesus said, touched her. Not the power and might of medicine, not the power and might of human beings with implements of war and all the power that we think that we have, but rather it was with the power of Jesus, because that power, he said, he felt it leave his body and go to her. And what the church had called cursed, and what the church had pushed outside of its doors, Jesus turned to and called her daughter. The sweetest words I've ever heard. The church had called her outcast, unclean, defiled. And Jesus called her daughter. Child of God. He goes into a situation where everybody's telling you there's death, and into a situation where death seems to rule, where death has had the final word. Jesus walks and calls life forward and says, now, do what we do. Have dinner. Have dinner. Feed her. Let's have a party. Let's have a dinner. Give her something to eat. Strengthen her. Encourage her. In our video of Wednesday night, Rob Bell talked about an ancient Hebrew concept called Shiva. When someone mourns, the people gather around that person and they sit Shiva with them. They don't explain. They don't talk. They come and they bring them food and they simply sit with them. They talk if they want to talk, or they're silent if they want to be silent, or they weep with them if they want to weep. They sit Shiva. I think that's one of the ways that we need to help one another in times of sorrow. To sit Shiva with one another. Encourage one another. Celebrate goodness and thanksgiving with one another. And then he reminded us of the last one. To remember that no matter where we are in our lives, that God sits Shiva with us in death, in life. No matter what the circumstance, God sits Shiva with us. And in that, whatever it is, God works life. Jesus said, unless a seed fall, it cannot bring forth new life. So even in the many deaths that we experience, God will bring life out of that. And not just a little, but a lot. The greatest story of all, the greatest two words, I think, in the Bible was when Jesus sat with Mary and Martha, when their brother died, what did he do? He felt their pain. He felt their sorrow as he sat Shiva with them. And he wept. He wept. It's okay to cry. If Jesus Christ, Lord of heaven, author of life itself, could weep, can we not weep as well? And then he got up from that weeping. And then what did he say? Come forth. Come into life. Step into life. May that be true for you and I this day. Amen.
Amen.